Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Ayo Akinwolere. It's now 6 defeats in their last 7 Premier League games for Liverpool, and they're currently seat 12th in the Premier League. And with Anfield getting restless, is Arne Slot's job at risk? All right, in with us today, we've got in the studio John Mackenzie. We've also got Ollie Kay as well. Liverpool 0, Nottingham Forest 3. The first time the Reds have lost back-to-back league matches by a margin of 3 or more goals since April 1965, Ollie. Look, that was under Bill Shankly. The supporters streamed out of Anfield when that third goal went in. Was this a sign that perhaps the tides are turning against Arne Slot?
I think the reaction was interesting, but I also think, 3-0 with, whatever it was, 15 minutes left, I think that is a fairly standard reaction up and down the country these days. I think a lot of people make a rush for the exits. It looked and sounded pretty negative in terms of the atmosphere, but I don't think, I've said this about Manchester United in recent weeks. At Liverpool, at Manchester United, which should be the two clubs with the most sort of biggest expectation, people would say most entitlement, the fans don't generally turn on the manager. They don't boo the manager. You don't get the kind of, you don't know what you're doing or jeering of a manager or anything like that at Liverpool, at Manchester United. The nearest Liverpool have had is that with that has been with Roy Hodgson in that ill-fated brief spell when, again, they didn't turn on him. There was just a few chants of Hodgson for England at the end of one match. And look, it's miles away from that with Slot. It really is. There's you go back to the Aston Villa and Real Madrid games a couple of weeks ago where they won, and his name was being shouted at huge volume. But what I've noticed is on social media, at least, there is an awful lot of people wanting to just pin everything on Slot, blame Slot for everything, change the manager. And I don't think that's ever a barometer of anything, but it does feel like there's, as Jamie Carragher said last night on Sky Sports, it doesn't feel like there's the same sort of enormous bank of goodwill and unconditional loyalty that Jurgen Klopp had. And maybe that's a sort of cult of personality thing, or maybe the affection for Slot hasn't had chance to sort of deepen to the extent it did for Klopp over the course of that journey. But yeah, it feels like there's a lot of negativity, put it that way. But I think we're miles away from seeing the kind of scenes where a crowd turns on a manager. That's not what's happening here.
Yeah, John, let's take it away from the emotion, because you've spoken about Slot's system and how we'd see the upsides in the first season, but it's the second season that perhaps things might potentially start getting tricky. Is that what we're seeing now?
Yeah, it's funny. I'd forgotten about this take, but I made it. I got positive comments on Liverpool Reddit, of all places. They trawled up this take that I had back in the pre-season podcast back in last season, before the season had even started. It's very flattering, but in many respects, it was overstated, my predictions in that podcast, because what I said was, with Slot, what you have is it's a sort of form of Roberto De Zerbi football, right? So the idea is we're so used to elite clubs wanting to possess the ball high up the pitch and try and create low blocks, break them down. You've seen it with Arsenal a lot this season. But with this new brand of manager, following on from Roberto De Zerbi, what they do is they want to possess the ball in deeper areas of the field to generate really nice conditions to just to attack, to create space rather than compressing space to attack. And then what you do is you work the ball around the back, and then you have these moments of these triggers when you shift the tempo. You get really quick, you go direct. And we saw that last season, right, with Mohamed Salah absolutely feasted last season in those conditions where Liverpool could possess the ball at the back, work it around until the right moment, and then find him. And he had that one of the best, I think, individual seasons we've seen in the Premier League. Which followed what I expected to happen. But what we've seen this season, and the reason why I was maybe a little bit more critical about the second season, is I think when you play in those ways, the way that opponents will eventually respond is by saying, well, fine, we're not going to allow you that space to attack into. We'll sit a little bit deeper. We'll close off the space, and then you'll have to focus on breaking us down, right? Which is, again, like obviously everyone wants to attack in space, but if you're so good at doing it, if the opponent refuses that space, then it becomes much more difficult. So I sort of anticipated this happening, but I think what's actually happened is, and what's maybe surprised me a little bit more is not really that Liverpool have struggled to break down low blocks, which they have, I think, but they've also struggled with playing against much more transitional play as well, because when you sit deeper, you win the ball back, and then you're attacking into space. Those have been the situations that Liverpool have struggled in a lot this season with, and Arne Slot has talked about this in a lot of his post-match press conferences, but teams going direct against them. I think the highest number of direct balls by a long margin in the Premier League, apart from Bournemouth. And that's what they've struggled with, the defensive aspects of that, this more sort of transitional game the other direction, and as a result, they've not been able to hold on to clean sheets for as long, and they've conceded earlier, generally speaking. I think particularly in the recent games, a few. I think I've got the data in front of me here, where in the last few games, so Palace 9 minutes first goal conceded, Chelsea 14 minutes, Man United 2 minutes, Brentford 5 minutes, City 29 minutes. So they're conceding the first goal. They're also conceding it much earlier, and that is changing the game state. And I think it was almost the opposite way around last season, where they were able to get the first goal themselves and then use that to open up opponents and have more and more space to attack. What we see now is opponents refusing to play to their terms, and as a result, being able to hit them in transition, score the goal, and then control the game out from there. So it's been a very different tactical sort of landscape for Slot this season, and it's one that they've not really navigated that well.
Okay. Well, Ollie, I want to talk about some of the personnel, and I think we should start with Alexander Isak, a player I know you've written about. And if you look at that match against Nottingham Forest, some of the stats are actually quite damning. You look at a player played 68 minutes, touches 14, expected goals 0.19, shots just 1, shots on target 0. I mean, for a guy they paid a lot of money for, every week just feels like it's compounding the fact that perhaps this wasn't the best deal or the right player for Liverpool.
I think it's really interesting. It's fascinating what's happening with Isak and what's happening with Liverpool, because I feel like it's not your sort of standard situation where a player joins a club for big money and it just looks wrong. I think why it's looking wrong is the fact that he arrived 2nd of September, transfer deadline day, having basically missed pre-season in order to force the transfer. That was his decision. That was something he and his camp felt they needed to do to get the move they wanted. He had a lot of criticism at the time. It hurt Newcastle at the time, the first few weeks of the season certainly, but it's hurt him. And it's hurt Liverpool, and it's hurt Sweden, because what has arrived is a player that just doesn't look fit. And Arne Slot has tried to sort of play him into form by picking him in the starting lineup. Not, sometimes for 45 minutes, sometimes for 70 minutes, sometimes for 80 minutes, but generally he's tried to pick him and start him. And he's got injured. He's picked up 2 injuries, and the 4 matches he started in the Premier League, they've lost, and he's not really contributed in a big way to those games, apart from the sort of touch against Chelsea for Gakpo's goal, which some people think was lucky, some people think was genius. He's a brilliant player, brilliantly talented player. John might have a different view on this, but I feel like it could. I could see the logic behind feeling that he would be an addition that would enhance what they do going forward, particularly in the sort of long term with a post-Salah landscape and a team that might be built more around Wirtz and other players rather than a forward line built around Mo Salah. But what I think we're seeing at the moment is just a player who isn't fit. And I wonder whether, with hindsight, rather than trying to sort of play him into fitness, Slot would have been better off just, and look, it is certainly with hindsight, because I wasn't suggesting this at the time, but just going with Ekitike, who was in form and was, obviously picked up that suspension, which complicated matters. But just going with Ekitike, give Isak 20 minutes here, 20 minutes there, maybe some of the sort of easier games in the Champions League, rather than imagining that having played 29 minutes for Sweden in the international break, he was ready to lead the line against Nottingham Forest on Saturday. And I would also say that Forest defended absolutely brilliantly. They came under real pressure, particularly in the first half. I thought the first half hour was actually a good, reasonably good Liverpool performance. And there were moments where it wasn't really that far away from clicking in terms of, one or two Salah, Isak link-ups. But as the game went on, he just looked, he's not got another sprint in him. He looked like he wasn't fit. And that is a big problem, because even though you can say, well, once he's fit, it will start to work. But now that he's had this sort of fairly tortured first 2 or 3 months as a Liverpool player, as the most expensive player in Premier League history, it brings a sort of spotlight and a psychological burden that wouldn't have been there if he'd been able to sort of hit the ground running. And he's playing in a team where nothing else is really working. The connections aren't working. He's one of the connections isn't working. So I feel like the whole picture, and this is what I wrote about, has become incredibly complicated for Isak, and that what started as a match fitness issue is going to become more and more of an issue unless quickly something clicks. And I think in the short term, you would have to say Slot would be better advised to go with Ekitike and stop trying to prioritise playing Isak into form when you've probably also got other players, McAllister, Konate, etc., who are also sort of trying to be played into form. It's a really muddled picture.
I wonder how hard it is to drop a player you've paid so much money for, John, in many respects. But also, Ollie makes an interesting point in terms of the team not working. And I'm just trying to compare him to his Swedish compatriot, Gyökeres, who had a very similar start to the season, but still 4 Premier League goals so far, a couple in the Champions League, in a way that Isak sort of hasn't hit the ground running. Is it the team around him that we need to look at, not the quality of the player necessarily?
I'm not going to get drawn into talking about Arsenal here. I see what you're doing.
Really New England, really New England.
No, but context is everything. In my job, context is everything. It's very easy to think about tactics as being this sort of like overarching theoretical thing that just exists out there, and the coach either has it right or doesn't. And if your ideas are correct, then you'll be fine. Football is just absolutely not like that. The tactical aspect is one small aspect of a much broader, I guess, microcosm of, or just almost like a micro environment where everything has to be right. And the difference between Gyökeres and the difference between Isak is that they're going into very different teams at very different moments with very different momentum. And I think that's the thing. I like to talk about cascade effects when I talk about what's happening in football clubs, because so I'll give you an example of a cascade effect. This is a fun story. So the end of the 1800s, sea otter living all along the west coast of the US, and these sea otters, they live off sea urchin, so they eat the sea urchin, and that's fine. But what starts happening is they start getting hunted for their pelts. Right. The sea otter die off. That means the sea urchin are more proliferate because they're not being eaten. The main source of food for the sea urchin is kelp, the seaweed. So because there's more sea urchin, there's less kelp because they're eating more, and kelp is fundamental to the marine environment around that part of the coast. And with the kelp all dying off, there's less places for these emergent like communities of sea life to exist in. One little change, killing off the sea otters, has a massive effect across the rest of the board for the marine life on the east west coast of the US. Same thing happens in football. As soon as one thing goes wrong, everything can fall apart, and suddenly you'll feel as though you're doing the same things that you were doing before, but the conditions have changed, and that means that again, is Isak not a good striker? No, of course that's not the case. Is Viet suddenly bad at football? No. What's changed here is that they've been put into an environment where the conditions have changed, and there's been all of these cascade effects where the tactics may be similar, but the squad's changed, the momentum has changed. We talk about the tragedy that Liverpool went through in the summer. That has an impact. These players are human beings. They're like you and me. They wake up in the morning and sometimes they have a bad day. When something as tragic as what happened with Diogo Jota happens, that has impacts, has ripple effects, and it changes the way that people behave. It impacts performances. So I think with essentially what we're talking about here is very high performance individuals coming into an environment where things are a little bit off, and those cascade effects then start happening. And the result is that, something that seemed so like an approach that seemed to so unbeatable last season suddenly seems completely fragile this.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, you aren't listening to David Attenborough. You're actually listening to John Mackenzie from The Athletic. Yeah, good point there, mate, honestly. And I just want to touch on another one, Ollie, in terms of Virgil van Dijk. He told his teammates, we're letting the manager and ourselves down after Saturday's defeat. It's a noticeable change from the Liverpool captain, who, I guess by his standards as well, probably hasn't had the best season himself.
Yeah, well, if you look at what happened with the dodo in Mauritius, no. Van Dijk is far from a dodo. It is interesting because look, with Van Dijk, I feel like if you looked at the first few weeks of the season when Liverpool were kind of not scraping their way through games, but they were kind of winning them by very, very small margins, often very late on. Canate alongside him had started the season poorly. Kirkaz had started the season sort of very exuberantly but poorly. There was sort of a turnover at right back, whether it's Bradley, Frimpong, Szoboszlai. And I thought Van Dijk was having an outstanding season, sort of pulling a sort of makeshift defence together. Even going into that sort of Brentford game where he got some criticism at the end of, what was that about? October, he was still winning an enormous number of headers. People talk about Liverpool's vulnerability in the air. He was winning an enormous number of headers, blocking various things, having he was sort of holding a defence together. And I think, as John was talking about, the whole, it spreads, the sort of uncertainty spreads. It's not necessarily him feeling uncertain in himself, but probably doubting everything that's around him. I don't even feel like he's having as good a season as he did before, but I don't think he is I don't think his form has been a massive problem. I think he's just trying to sort of, I think what it looks like is connections are breaking down in his team. Trust and confidence is sort of spiraling downwards. But I doubt anybody in that team is thinking, "Oh God, no, we've got to cover for Virgil here." I don't think Virgil van Dijk is the problem at all. I think he would probably be last on my list of problems in terms of the Liverpool team at the moment. But he's not. I mean, he's not had a great month, put it that way. But I think that's just what happens when teams sort of fall into really bad form and fall into a crisis of confidence, where, as John says, you can look at micro tactical issues and say, look, this is if you did this, if only you played Joe Gomez at right back and then freed up Szoboszlai to play in midfield, everything would be fine. I think we can all look at things and say, theoretically, yes, you could make this tweak and it would be better. But what I think the last few months have shown, and what countless examples have shown in the past, and I used the example last week of an article on The Athletic about the sort of disastrous Chelsea title defences under Conte and Mourinho, and what happened with Man City last season. When it unravels, when a team goes from being sort of confident, free scoring, and everything working, and when it unravels and there's just a sudden sort of confidence crisis, it just spreads. Problems spread.
Yeah, before we carry on, I need to tell you guys about the Sucker 100. It's a brand new book from The Athletic. Ollie, I'm hoping you've got your copy there. Tell the people what they need to know about this book.
Let me have a look. Oh yes, it's there. It's fantastic. I'm so proud of what we as a team have put together with this book. I think it's excellent. It's ranking, or no, it's not ranking. It's not really about ranking. It's titled "The Story of the Greatest Players in History." So it's about not necessarily the 100 greatest players, but 100 of the greatest players, which you can probably guess who the probably the top three would be. But we're telling stories of, if I take if I go at random, you've got George Weah, Stanley Matthews. Number 100 is Uwe Seeler, the great German player of the 60s, and Seb Stavrou has written a wonderful piece about him. I wrote about, for example, Kenny Dalglish. Things we're talking about Liverpool on this podcast. I interviewed Kenny Dalglish for it, and he was talking about not just his background, but about the type of player he was, and talk about sort of the tricks of his trade and using shadows and certain passes he would play for Ian Rush. I find that absolutely fascinating, and there are just some absolutely remarkable stories in there. There's Jack Lang, who's our Brazilian expert, has done a wonderful profile of Garrincha, the great Brazilian winger of the 50s and 60s. Matthias Sindelar, a great Austrian player of the 30s, who's probably a name people wouldn't recognise. Mark Critchley has done a brilliant piece about the sort of mysterious circumstances of his death in Vienna at the start of the war. It's a fascinating book.
Yeah, I mean, it's what we do best here at The Athletic. All our journalists together talking about football, talking about players as well. So make sure you get your hands on that. Soccer 100 from The Athletic. I'm interested in what's going on upstairs for Slot, Ollie. What are the bigwigs saying at Liverpool in terms of his situation? Are there any murmurings of perhaps, I don't know, they're not happy with him? I mean, it's surely too early to say.
The murmurings I've heard from within the club have been very, very positive in terms of being solid in support of Slot and sympathetic to the difficulties he's facing, whether it's sort of integrating players or players who have had sort of stop-start in terms of injuries or arriving in an unfit condition. In the case of Isak, there's the phrase or the message that has been relayed to me is sort of no panic. We're confident. We're confident in the changes we made in the summer, and we're confident in a manager who delivered the league title 6 months ago.
John, then let's go back to the team then. Ollie talks about, how, and you spoke about it, how there are other factors here, but then you've got to look at the conversation around even their striking opportunity here. Ekitike, a striker in form, Slot's picks the guy that's not in form. Could he be doing more with the players at his disposal, with the system that he's got?
I think it's worth asking the question of how the squad build this summer impacted the tactical approach. I think, again, we talked about tactics before as the sort of overarching sort of the ideas and the strategies that you're going to use to try and get results. But your tactics and strategies are only as good as the players that you have, certainly from profile point of view as well, right? So I think part of the issue that we're seeing this season is that the system that worked so well last season, we talked about it already, it's about possessing the ball deep in across your back line and then having those moments of trigger and shifts of tempo where you start going direct. You can do that when you have, in your back line, three really good progressive passers in Andy Robertson, Virgil van Dijk and Trent Alexander-Arnold. Those players can help find the players in front of them when the space opens out for you to attack. This season they've had Kerkez, Frimpong, Bradley, obviously Van Dijk's still there, but those guys are ball carriers, and it's a very different kind of profile of player to try and enact those strategies. So I think a big part of what's happened this season is that the players that Liverpool have brought in haven't really suited the strategy that Slot was playing last season. That raises lots of questions, right? It raises questions about a recruitment department that's been the best in the world for a decade. It raises questions about the relationship between the recruitment department and the coach in terms of recognising the kind of profiles that they might want. But I think that for me, I think it's a valid question to ask, because it almost feels as though when Slot was presented with a squad that he didn't have a huge amount of say in last season. I mean, they barely brought anyone in. They brought in Chiesa and Mamardashvili, who then promptly went back out on loan. When he was faced with a squad that it wasn't of his building, the football looked much better. And as soon as they started building a squad for him, everything fell apart. So there's definitely questions to be asked there as well. So I don't think it's quite so simple as being able to be like, well, he hasn't been provided with the players, because it's like the meme of the guy in the hot dog suit, right? We're still trying to find the guy who did this. He's been involved in those decisions. So yeah, I think there are questions about whether or not Slot could have done things differently, or whether or not he should be held responsible for the way that this squad has played. The manager's responsibility is to get the most out of the squad that's presented to them, but they're also involved in the building of that squad. So yeah, I think these are the interesting questions. Is the solution now only going to be solvable in the market? Are they going to have to bring in those players that they've needed for a while? More progressive options from the back line, maybe a bit more of a defensive presence in the sort of defensive midfield slot, etc. What's happened now that has Salah been marginalised? Is there just a drop off? He is getting towards the end of his career. All of these questions, I think, need to be answered. But I think what I would expect from any really good coach worth their salt is the ability to take those problems and find solutions. And the classic example of that, I say classic, it was last season, right? Pep Guardiola was faced with a squad that couldn't do what he wanted to do. The landscape of the Premier League had changed, become so much more physical. His players weren't able to play his tactics weren't able to function the way that he wanted them to. And actually, I say this a lot, and it annoys a lot of people, but I think what was incredible about Man City last season is they had that awful November. Everything went similar to what we've seen with Liverpool. He dragged those players back, and he did that not just because he sort of almost threw his tactics in the bin and said, right, we're just going to have to make this squad work somehow. They did bring in players in January, but they still used the old guys who were getting a little bit physically past it. Made that work, and he brought the players with him. And that's the difficult thing, I think, is it's not just having the ideas of how can you make this work a bit better. When you get into those negative spirals, the hardest thing to do is to pull the players along with you, and Guardiola did that. And I think for me, that's what I'm most interested in seeing, whether or not Slot can do that. Can he throw his tactics in the bin and say, fine, we've got to make something work here? Can he drag the players with him?
Yeah, look, a lot of people are now saying Slot won the league with Klopp's team. Is that fair?
Well, he did win the league with Klopp's team, but Klopp, who is a brilliant manager, didn't win the league with that team this previous season. They finished sort of third, and I would say what happened in the final months of that season, and also what Slot did subsequently, demonstrates that Klopp was sort of running out of energy and running out of ideas and inspiration. I felt, look at Liverpool that 23-24 season, they had moments where everything clicked and it looked fantastic. But for a lot of the season, they didn't look like a very well coached team. They looked like a really well managed team who were kind of all, pumped up and running for, still running through brick walls for the manager, and maybe a lot of it was sort of muscle memory in terms of what he'd done with them previously. It felt like, it was a team that was that would certainly need improving if they were to win the Premier League title. And I think when Slot took over and they only added an unfit Chiesa in that first transfer window, nobody was saying they were going to win the league with Klopp's team. And I think what we saw through most of the last season was a team that was tactically, structurally, and also in terms of just focus and game management and mentality, looked so much better than Klopp's team the season before. So although I have the most enormous admiration for Klopp, Slot was an upgrade when he arrived, because Slot was able to do things with the tiring, fading Klopp of those last 12 months or so wasn't able, 2 years or so perhaps, wasn't able to do with those players. Whereas this season, I think, I would praise Slot to the heavens for what he did last season, but so far this season he has not been able to find the solutions, whether it was sort of structural, tactical in the first few weeks of the season. I think where things needed to be, there'll be the accusation, perhaps from me and perhaps from others as well, that you perhaps try to change it a bit too quickly, try to integrate too many of the new players immediately, has perhaps tried to play people back into form when you're not really able to carry passengers who are, or 2 or 3 players who aren't in form. And it's created a situation where this season there's now a crisis. It's a crisis, and it calls for sort of crisis management in terms of stopping the rot, lifting the mood, dragging a team through. It's we talk a lot about coaching, a lot more about coaching than we ever used to in this country, which is great. But I think this is a situation which, more than anything, calls for really, really strong forthright management. I think it was the same with Guardiola last season. He did things which he probably hadn't been able to do, or hadn't had to do at early stages in his career. It's firefighting now. And I'd say that having not had a great season in terms of managing this transition from Klopp's team into his team, he's now faced with a situation where he has to show that sort of man management, that team management, that he can drag them out of this crisis and put them back on the right track. And it's a totally different skill.
And any lessons to be learned from how Guardiola turned it around last season for Slot? Because yes, there's so many permutations here, right? A slumped team, a coach that's looking for new ideas and tactics. But I mean, there is a blueprint in various renditions of the Premier League that you can maybe look back to.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, the tactical landscape of the Premier League has shifted as well. So I think it's hard to expect coaches to just have these ready-made solutions. It's not like, oh, if this approach isn't working, then we've got this other plan B that's working for everyone else. I think there's a sense in which every coach in the Premier League is coming to terms with the tactical landscape, and that's why I think it's so competitive in the Premier League right now. Liverpool are in the position they're in, having lost a ton of games recently, but they're still well within touching distance of the top four. So there's negatives and there's positives there. But yeah, I think with Guardiola, it was very much a case of saying, what's our weakness? Well, we're getting caught out in transition all the time, so we need to overload the centre of the field. We don't have the physicality necessarily to be able to defend in the way that we're defending. So let's introduce a little bit more transitional play into our team. I think it's a different problem that Slot is facing, but again, the same issues are there. It's with these games coming up, I think they've got to focus on a few like simple things. We've talked already that like they're struggling in games because they're conceding first. If they can get those goals, the opening goals in games, I mentioned the Villa game, a good example of that, where they managed to get the first goal there and then went on for the win. And I think that's what they're going to have to do in these games, because as Ollie points out, a game against someone like Leeds on paper, you look at it and think, oh, that's a nice settler for a manager in these situations. But as we've said, the issues that they're facing, Liverpool, are long balls, second ball losses, and then getting caught in that way. That's the way that this Leeds team has been built. So again, if that Leeds team gets the early goal and then is able to sit a bit deeper and take fewer risks, the game state just gets away from you. So I think the focus has to be almost like small picture, like details in games. This is where the weaknesses of these teams are. Try and get the first goal. Let's come out and be aggressive here. On paper, we have the better players, so we should be able to just come out, be really aggressive, 50 minutes, try and get that first goal. And then if we do, the game state will favour us much more. But I guess the big question then is, like, in the long run, like where do you go from there? Because it's not just a case of turning this ship around. I think that's what we've seen from Guardiola as the counter example. Is last season City had a weird season. They were top of the league until match day 9. They had a horrible November, and then from December the 1st onwards, they put up the most points in the league despite having a game fewer than Arsenal and Liverpool, who obviously had caveats for why maybe they performed a little bit lower in terms of the points, but that's what Guardiola did. He ground out to the end of the season. This season, they've had to do something different. They can't just grind. They've got to try and find a new way of playing that will allow them to dominate. So I guess that in the short term, it's kind of like, well, how do we win these immediate games and stabilise ourselves long enough that we can then think about the longer term picture and think, is this issue here is it more intrinsic? Is it a tactical approach issue here? Like we said before, if teams are going to sit deep against us and go long, do we have the players to do that? Are we able to withstand some of the issues that kind of approach faces? So yeah, big questions. But I think the focus right now should be on the small questions in the next few games.
Jeremy Carragher, obviously former Liverpool legend, was also saying that perhaps Liverpool need to spend the same kind of money they spent in the summer, again, to sort of rectify this situation. Is that one step too far? Isn't it just surely about damage limitation right now? Finding out, as John said, get back to basics, understand how we want to play this kind of football, and just see where we end this season, and then we build again next season.
I think the idea of them spending big in January on 2 or 3 more players is probably hard for people to understand after the summer they had. But it was their first. Well, they've not really been very active in the transfer market for a long time. There was the summer of 2023 when they brought in Gravenberch, McAllister and Endo and Szoboszlai. But apart from that, sort of over the course of about 7-8 years, really, it's been really minimal change. It's been evolution rather than revolution. And I think for that reason, there were an awful lot of issues building up at once, sort of compounded by the departure of Trent Alexander-Arnold, which was against the club's wishes, and compounded, of course, by the loss of Diogo Jota, which is just kind of thing that has just had so many effects. But in terms of the very relatively trivial matter of squad building, made things more difficult and more complicated. But they are, despite spending all the money they spent in the summer, they are a central defender light. Even before they lost Leone to injury on his debut in the Carabao Cup.
He's only 18. I mean, you wouldn't expect him to lead the line, would you? I mean, he's still a young lad learning his trade.
No, exactly, and that's why they wanted Mark Gahey, and they thought they were going to get him on transfer deadline day. I think if he had arrived, he would have played a lot of football because Ibrahima Konate just doesn't seem to be at it this season. Whether he would have improved the sort of aerial question, I don't know. It's an interesting one, but you could question about whether they're a midfielder light in terms of their options. That whether they need. Remember that the first player that Slot wanted was a number 6 when he arrived, and they didn't get Zubimendi, and then Gravenberch sort of reinvented himself brilliantly to brilliant effect last season. But I feel like that sort of Gravenberch McAllister axis, which worked so well last season, just isn't really working as well this season. Whether it's McAllister's form or whether it's that opponents have found a way to sort of outmuscle them in key areas, or maybe expose one or other of them physically. And then you look at their wide options. I mean, yes, they bought 2 centre forwards at enormous expense. They bought Florian Wirtz, but they also lost Luis Diaz. And to my mind, they've not replaced him. They look at least one wide player, or at least one forward short. When you look at last season, they always had good attackers to be able to come off the bench. And I think this season it doesn't seem to have been the same issue. I mean, they've called off Federico Chiesa, who is clearly a good player, but who Slot seems to doubt physically. Isak has the question marks that we've mentioned in terms of the physical side. Rio Ngamo has made a number of appearances from the bench, most successfully against Newcastle back in August. That seems a long time ago, but it looks like it doesn't look like a complete squad. So although they did all of that in the summer, it feels like there is another phase of this rebuild that is necessary. And unlike in the summer, it feels like that's going to have to be approached from a position of weakness and with a degree of desperation. So whether any of that happens in January or whether they put it all off until the summer, I don't know. But I think they absolutely do need another central defender, because there seems to be a question of whether he trusts Joe Gomez. If Joe Gomez hasn't been playing so far, then does he trust him? And yeah, you think, well, what would happen? We questioned Virgil van Dijk's form earlier, but if Van Dijk was injured, I feel like it could disintegrate further. And he's playing so much football, he's not really getting a rest. So that they need another central defender, sure, with great certainty, not just for the medium long term, but absolutely for the short term as well.
Okay, well, yeah, Liverpool next, PSV in the Champions League, West Ham away, Sunderland at home, and then Leeds away. Technically on paper, those are winnable, but in this form, who knows? All right, guys, thanks so much for joining us. Ollie, appreciate your time. And also, John, thanks for joining us as well. Don't forget to like the video and also leave us a comment. Is Arne Slot running out of time at Liverpool? We'll catch you soon. For more from the Athletic FC podcast, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. We've got top journalists like David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the entire season. Make sure you don't miss an episode of the Athletic FC. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts from.